Hey YouTube, I wanted to make another video today. The next one's coming up this week from our third and final podcast on the art of war, so I think you guys will enjoy those too. But today I'm making another video responding to a different video from the Skeptical Agnostic. I already made one responding to his 10 things Christians cannot answer, and in that video he cites another video on miracles and chance, discussion of what's a miracle, what's just happenstance. And I watched the video and I thought there were some important points to address, so that's what today's video is going to be about. Hey, make sure to check out old videos, and I'm going to cite a few in here. Go poke around the channel and check those out, and thanks to all my new subscribers. So I do want to say first of all that David Hume, I've said this before, but David Hume did have the last word on miracles in his writing on miracles. That is, for a materialist. If you are a materialist, then yes, it is more likely that someone is lying than something impossible within your worldview happened. That's straightforward. But the Skeptical Agnostic in his own video says that he is not closed to miracles in his worldview. So I'm going to assume he's not an absolute materialist or an agnostic materialist, maybe. So then we're going to go a little bit further. And just directly, the main thrust of his video, I think, falls under this, that we'll talk about more. It's important to notice that you can get rid of miracles merely by defining them away. So a really basic approach would be to say, well, only things that are impossible are miracles, right? Miracles are the things that are impossible. But anything that happens is possible by definition. So anything that happens isn't a miracle, so therefore miracles don't exist. Skeptical Agnostic's not quite doing that, but I do think he is doing a version of that, which I'll get to. But just the point being made, if something happens and therefore it's possible, then it's not a miracle because miracles are impossible. You've defined it away simply by definition. And so I think the variation on this is, rather than saying miracles are that which is impossible, Skeptical Agnostic says, well, miracles are that which are improbable. Okay. But then he goes on to get rid of them by saying, well, actually everything that's improbable is actually probable, so therefore miracles don't exist. And so it's really a dismissal by definition in the main. And so I think that's a fairly weak argument, but there's more there in the video that is important to discuss and talk about, so we'll go on with that. I'm going to make two overall points. Number one will be the assumption of infinity, because I think that's really important and something that applies to a lot of other areas that we'll talk about. And number two, the assumption of meaninglessness, which I've talked about elsewhere and we'll cite when we get there. But the first one, the Skeptical Agnostic goes into this discussion of, well, in order to talk about probabilities, well, we have this world of vast possibilities. It's because we have this world of vast possibilities that highly improbable events are actually expected. But we've now assumed, we've taken it for granted that we live in a world of vast probabilities. That is something that needs explanation. Why do we get to take for given that we live in a world of vast possibilities? And we'll go on just a few more examples. He talks about the sample space. Well, he says in a large enough sample space, then these improbable events become probable. Okay, we have an infinite sample space, or functionally infinite, it seems. Close enough to infinite. You could argue about that, but I have videos arguing about that. Check out my earlier videos on the infinite versus the finite, the myth of the finite. Why do we get to just assume, just take for granted an infinite sample space? People do this in the multiverse argument against fine-tuning. So fine-tuning first came about, I think, about the solar system being fine-tuned, and then scientists were like, well, it's really not actually that fine-tuned. There's a lot of play in the orbits. things aren't that exact. And then the fine-tuning argument progressed to saying, well, actually the physical constants of the universe are very fine-tuned. And so far what I've seen, the only response people have had is, well, that's just because there's actually infinite created universes, and the only ones that work are the ones we find ourselves in. So of course we find ourselves in one that works and has specific fine-tuned constants, but that's just the result of infinitely creative universes and a bunch of them failing and only the working ones working. Okay. But here we're assuming that there's infinite created universes. So see David Deutsch on there's no such thing as an explanationless theory. We need an explanation for where infinite created universes come from. Why do we just take for granted infinite creative potential at the beginning of all these arguments? Because there's actually a word for infinitely creative infinite potential. That's God. So how are you going to disprove God by saying, oh, I can disprove God because there's infinitely creative infinite potential, we don't need God? Okay. Because God's here, we don't need God. You just called it by a different name. So I do recognize that people wouldn't immediately connect infinity with God as such, and they're sort of like the sterile mathematic conception of infinity. But this is something I talk about a lot in my earlier videos, in my book, Purpose in Form. So again, the myth of the finite is one of those. That's one of our podcasts, and then there's a bunch of clips. I have that in some of the earliest videos. So if you're interested in that, go look in those places. And then the second point is about meaning, the assumption of meaninglessness, assuming that things don't have any meaning. And to get at this, we'll talk about the example that the Skeptical Agnostic brings up in his video. He talks about the man who was planning on being on a plane on 9/11, and it ended up being one of those planes that got hijacked and taken down, and he wasn't on the plane for some serendipitous reason, and he interpreted that as God intervening in his life. And he says, that's a miracle, and now I can't remember how he portrays it. Maybe he was already a believer, but he believes in miracles, and this was a miracle. Okay. So the truth is that Skeptical Agnostic is right in a lot of his analysis of this. This is not going to be a powerful proselytizing tool. Your subjective experience does not just translate into the other person's belief. And there's actually more problems with it than I think Skeptical Agnostic takes. I'm going to take issue with the argument he makes against it, which is basically like, well, that's just a subjective meaning, therefore that doesn't mean anything. I think that's totally wrong. But that argument in general of, in this case, didn't get on a plane, the plane went down. Well, there's all sorts of other questions you could ask, like, so God only wanted to save you? Like, he didn't want to save anyone else on the plane? Also, if God was doing a miracle, why didn't he just not let terrorists take over the plane? So those are good, valid questions, and they poke holes in the idea of like, I had this experience of meaning and miracle, and I can just hand that to you, and now you should believe too. They get you into all sorts of theodicy and stuff that you have to get into, which is not the point of this video. But it is my point to say, if my argument is X happened, I experienced it as such, and therefore I believe in meaning, and so should you, that is not a rigorous academic philosophical reasoning to meaning, or reasoning to back up miracles. I'm going to use the two interchangeably and talk about that a little bit later. But that's true. That's not a fantastic argument, and it's not a enormously effective proselytizing tool. However, on the opposite side of the spectrum, people looking at that and saying, well, that's just silly wish fulfillment reasoning, And obviously you should accept the better, more highly reasonable conclusion that nothing is meaningful. That's just everything's a coincidence, everything's random, and we're just broken humans who impose meaning on the world, and meaning doesn't actually mean anything. Well, there's immense problems with that, and that's most of what the first part of my book, Purpose Informed, is dedicated to. Got many videos on that. Check out the meaninglessness of meaninglessness, for example, and any videos scattered around that. But to put it briefly, saying that everything's random, and that's another video, the faith in fundamental randomness. But saying that everything's random, everything's meaningless, why are you saying it? Why are you telling me? You're telling me because you believe in the meaning of spreading truth. So you're already not acting on what you say. And so in reality, that's a much more absurd point of view, is to say things aren't meaningful and we're just making up meaning, than the person who's like, I've experienced meaning and therefore I believe in meaning and or miracles. And I'm going to defend that claim right now. So I don't think it's the case that miracles prove meaning or miracles prove God's action in the sense of proving to someone else, being a proselytizing tool, saying this happened to me, therefore you can believe. That's not a good use of them, and I don't think that's what's properly happening. I think a better way to state what's happening when someone has that experience of, I didn't get on the plane. He had the experience of, wow, I didn't get on the plane, and that had enormous impact in my life, and all of my choices have meaning, and the path that I've been on seems meaningful, and where I'm going to, I hope, has meaning. He was awakened to the presence of meaning, or more fully awakened to the presence of meaning. And so I think the proper construing of it is not, this subjective thing happened to me, therefore I extrapolate to all meaning everywhere, but rather the reality is that meaning is ubiquitous, meaning is inherent, infinite, and therefore these little moments, these miracles, or these things that allow you to open up to the meaning in life are like flashing lights that awaken you. They reorient you, they remind you, you recollect the meaning. They're not proving meaning, they're not establishing meaning, they're not creating meaning. They are restoring your view of the already inherent meaning. So from this sense, it's not a question of proving something that's doubtful. It's restoring you to the sane view that meaning exists and purpose exists and significance exists, which you really can't escape believing, but we've inculcated ourselves with these myths of meaninglessness and purposelessness and insignificance and all that through taking our own endeavors and stories seriously and getting those ingrained in our brain. But anyhow, I've talked about that elsewhere again. So the point is, it doesn't actually take this terribly rigorous academic argument to restore meaning. Meaning is already there. It's just there. It just is. Returning you to it, it doesn't matter how you jump ship. Just jump ship and rejoin sanity. So in that case, I would simply say it's true. You cannot prove meaning objectively. Skeptical agnostic is really adamant on like objective proofs and know beyond a shadow of doubt. You can't, because meaning is subjective. That's the thing that meaning is. It's a subjective experience inherently. Yes. But unless you're a logical positivist, that's not a problem. And if you're a logical positivist, then you've got other problems. So go sort those out. And same thing with it. If you believe that life is inherently meaningless, well, you're actually more silly and out of line than the benighted peasant who just, something happened to me, therefore I believe in miracles. So in this sense, I'm treating miracle as a subset of meaning, of just a special thing that awakens you to God's presence and God's action, but it functions the same way as the argument for meaning being ubiquitous, because God's action is ubiquitous. Everything around you is God's actions. God's active creation is what you are looking at. So seeing something and going, oh my gosh, a bright flashy light, wow, God's at work, God's created things. You're just returning you to the basic reality. Anything you look at is God's creation. So it's exactly the same argument as meaning being everywhere. It's the view of, well, meaning doesn't exist and God doesn't exist, which again are the same, as I've argued elsewhere. It's that view that's the weird, non-functional, not super rational aberration that you should discard at all, discard in whatever manner, by any means necessary, and it doesn't actually have to have this super rational impetus. For the people who want that, that's out there. There are arguments about it. There's many in my book, Purpose and Form. So for those who want that and feel like they need that, great, go find it. But that's not a reason to think that, the person who doesn't take that path is somehow failing by returning to simple reality and sanity. So anyhow, again, similar to my last videos, the problem is a frame shift. The problem is what mindset are you approaching, what worldview are you approaching with, and that affects how you address the discussion. Skeptical agnostic is right that you can't objectively prove meaning, because meaning is by definition subjective, and that that miracles aren't just this great proselytizing tool that other people are going to believe beyond a shadow of a doubt immediately. Of course not. But the main question is, why are we captured by this mythology of meaninglessness and purposelessness and just sterile secularism that tells us, well, everything is, meaningless, insignificant, but at least by following the truth and you being a smart guy, you figured it out. Well, if you're meaningless and insignificant, your smartness and your wanting to follow the truth is meaningless and insignificant. So there's just this fundamental contradiction there. So get out of that, and then go worry about how we properly share our stories of miracles and decide how to rejoice in life and look at life as a gift. Thanks for watching. Check out the other videos on the channel and stay tuned for more. God bless.